Hey y'all, I'm Hope, and today's video is my mid-month reading update for March. And I'm pretty excited because March is going better for me so far in terms of reading than the last 2 months of the year have done. I read 3 books each in January and February, but so far in March, here at the midway point, I have read 4 books. So I'm really excited about that, and I'm glad that I'm getting some more momentum behind my reading now. Let's go ahead and dive into the books because I think I'm going to have a lot to say on a couple of these. So the first thing that I read was The Solstice Cabin by Arden Powell, and I keep forgetting the title of this one. This is the 4th in their Flows Magica fantasy romance series. It's a short novella, about 100 pages, and it follows David and Amaruk, who are 2 men who live in Toronto in kind of the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s. And at the beginning of this story, something pretty disastrous has happened with a mutual friend of theirs, and in the wake of this, Amaruk leaves David a note saying, "Hey, I'm leaving," and just disappears from David's life. And David's quite distraught by this because he's already had this one thing happen with their mutual friend, and now his best friend from his childhood has suddenly left him, and he's feeling very distressed and decides to go on this adventure to find Amaruk. It takes him 6 months. He ultimately finds Amaruk in a cabin up in the Northwest Territories of Canada, and that is where the story opens. So the 2 of them end up getting snowed into this cabin together because David arrives just as winter is starting to hit in the Northwest Territories. And so it's cute. It's very much a like forced proximity romance where they're pushed into this cabin together. They kind of have to reckon with their feelings and deal with the events that separated them in the first place. And I liked parts of this. I thought that parts of the romance were really cute. I think there's some interesting conversations here about anti-capitalism and why burnout culture is just bad for people and why it's unhealthy and maybe we should be looking for other ways to live. I think it's not a revolutionary conversation, but it's definitely a part of the story. And also Amaruk has a dog who is the goodest girl. She's a Malamute and she's adorable. I can't remember her name right now. That being said, I really can't recommend this book, and I feel like I'm reaching the end of my journey with Arden Powell's work because I really didn't like their horror novella The Bayou last year. And while I liked the first few installments of this Flows Magica series, I feel like this one had some major issues that just have kind of soured me on the series a little bit. First of all, I think I mentioned it's set somewhere in like the early 1900s or possibly late 1800s. It's really unclear in the book what time period it's supposed to be set in because everything in the book feels very modern. All of the dialogue is very modern. The characters behave in very like familiar ways, and there was just nothing that kind of grounded in a time period, except that throughout the novel, particularly right at the beginning, but then throughout we would get these reminders that the reason that they're in this kind of forced proximity situation and they're finally able to talk about how they feel about each other is because if they had been in Toronto and they had held hands or done anything like that, they would have been arrested for gross indecency. It's definitely set during a time period when these laws are in effect and are being used to target queer people. And there's also a mention briefly of the Wilde trial, so it has to be just after that at some point, because it's, I think, mentioned in a way that's like it's recent. So it's just after the Oscar Wilde trials, and that's kind of the only connection we get to this past time frame, is just that there are laws in place at this point that are being used to target queer people, and that is part of why these 2 men are having to be completely isolated in this cabin way up in the north in order to even like have these conversations with each other because it was too dangerous for them to have this conversation back in Toronto. I found that to be a little bit jarring because so much of the book felt modern. It kept really taking me out of the story every time I got that reminder because it felt like it was set in modern day Canada, and that was not the case. My second issue with this is that I really don't like David as a character, and he is the POV character. We read from his perspective for the entire book, and he's really kind of unpleasant and self-centered. A lot of the book is about him basically focusing entirely on himself, on the effects of things on himself, on the way he feels about things, and there's never really a moment where he really gets it and kind of looks beyond himself to be like, okay, maybe I'm in the wrong here, maybe I've fucked up in some way, and he definitely does at various points in the book cause harm to Amaruk. He hurts Amaruk's feelings, he's kind of insensitive, and it just never got to a point where David got it, that that was the way he was behaving or that his actions had effects on other people. And so I found him really unpleasant to be reading from. The last kind of issue I had with this was that, kind of going back to this issue of the history and the way that the book felt kind of unmoored in history, but it was really trying to pull on this particular time period where people were being targeted for being queer and were being arrested. It wants to draw on that. But there was this other element where Amaruk is an indigenous character, and of the two, he's definitely my favorite of the two characters. I think he's much more interesting and much nicer than David. He's more aware of others' feelings and also just a kinder person than David is. But my issue with this was that given the time period that it's set in, it felt like the book really wanted to draw on this history of how queer people have been treated historically, and it really didn't want to have to engage at all with any of the history around how Indigenous people have been treated, and it kind of sweeps that under the rug. Amaruk is the only Indigenous character we get. David is not the only white character that we get, but Amaruk is the only Indigenous character that we get in the story. We're led to believe that the only obstacles that he experienced really in growing up in Toronto, in his career in Toronto, is just that he felt kind of out of place, and also he had this one really racist coworker who is the reason that he's like decided to leave. And that just felt really disingenuous to me, to be trying so hard to pull on this one bit of history and this one kind of darker part of history, and then kind of sweep this other one under the rug and not address it at all. It just felt disingenuous, and it made me kind of uncomfortable reading the book. I was also, I think, while I was reading it, thinking of The House in the Cerulean Sea and the conversations around that happened right after TJ Klune talked about how it was inspired by the 60s Scoop and how people felt that the history was being used in a irresponsible, disrespectful way. And I was really thinking about those conversations while I was reading this because of the way that Amaruk's character is handled, and I just don't think he's handled very well at all. So anyway, I just felt that was a uncomfortable and disingenuous bit of writing in there, and as a result, I really feel like I'm kind of done with Arden Powell's work. I think I have one more book of theirs that I bought sometime in the past, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm probably going to read that, and then I think I'm done. The good news is I did like the next couple of things that I read in March. First of which was The Deep by River Solomon, which I listened to as an audiobook while I was working. And I have to say, if you're going to read this, I highly recommend the audiobook. The narration was done by David Diggs, and he does a phenomenal job. It was a really engaging audiobook, and I often struggle with audiobooks, so anytime I find one that can really keep my attention and allow me to really take in the story, I'm always really impressed. And this was just a really exceptional audiobook. But I really loved this story. This follows Yetu, who is the historian for the Wajinru people, who are a kind of mermaid type people that are descended from the women who were thrown overboard from slave ships during the Atlantic slave trade. And Yetu's role as the historian is that she holds on to all of the history for her people. So she has all of their memories of the past, all the way back to like 600 years before this book is set, when the first women were being thrown overboard, up until like the current day for them. And so she has all of these memories, and some of them are positive, and we get introduced to a few of the more positive memories that she has, but so much of it is really dark and frightening, and she feels like she's losing herself to the remembering. And so the book is about her kind of trying to grapple with that and try to figure out who she is outside of her role as the historian, because she feels like she was picked so young she didn't really get to have a sense of self before being the historian, and that's part of why she's struggling so much. But also she's kind of wondering, is maybe there a better way for this to happen? Maybe this role of the historian and having a single person responsible for all of this memory is not the way to continue forward. And so she's grappling with all of these questions, and it's just a really fascinating story. I really enjoyed Yetu as a character. I really liked going with her on her journey of kind of self-discovery. There's some really interesting questions in here about what it means to have this kind of a history, about what it means to have a history at all, what it means to have no history. Yetu meet some new people that are really interesting and have very different perspectives to her that I thought were a fun and interesting, I don't know if fun's the right word. They were an interesting counterpoint to Yetu's point of view as somebody who had all the history versus these other characters who don't have a history. And so I thought that was really interesting. There's also a pretty big element about the importance of community, and I just really enjoyed the way that all of that was done in this book. I think it is very dark and it's very intense to read, but I think it is beautifully written and absolutely worth the time if you pick it up, because it is just a fascinating book. And I'm so glad that I've read this finally. I'd started it about a year ago. and then I was in a slump, so I didn't finish it because I really wanted to come back to it when I knew I was more in the mood to read it. And I'm really glad that I've done that because I absolutely loved this. And River Solomon is very quickly becoming a favorite author for me. The next thing I read was from another favorite author of mine, which is Jane Austen. So I read Persuasion for a class, and I really enjoyed this one. Hilariously, I think it is my least favorite Jane Austen, but that's like, I gave it 4.5 stars versus 5. My ranking right now for Jane Austen is maybe Persuasion last, and then Northanger Abbey, and then Pride and Prejudice. But I really have enjoyed everything I've read from her. And this one is interesting. It has a slightly older protagonist. We're following Anne, who's the middle daughter of her family, and she's kind of mistreated by everyone. They're not very nice to her at all. She's just kind of going about her life at this point because she feels like she's lost an opportunity because several years ago she was engaged to this man named Wentworth. She really loved him, she really cared about him, and then her family persuaded her against marrying him because he had no money, he had no title, he had no land. And so she's persuaded against marrying him. She's very heartbroken about this, and now 8.5 years later, Wentworth becomes a part of her social circle again. And he is now a captain in the Navy. This is in the period between, it's like a brief period of peace in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. It's after Napoleon's first defeat, but before he comes back and is defeated a second time. And so it's set in this like brief period of peace for the Navy when Wentworth is back on land and he is now looking for a wife. And so he becomes a part of her social circle, and she's having to deal with like her feelings for him and how she still has affections for him, but she's not sure how he feels about what happened, and she thinks he's probably quite angry with her. And then there's also this like expanding social circle that's happening where the connections are getting like more and more complex, and there's various different connections between the different people involved. And it's just a really fascinating read. I really enjoyed this. I think Anne's a really interesting protagonist to follow. She's a little bit older than other Austen protagonists, and she's also just a very interesting character because she's very much in the background of her own story a lot of the time. She's always being pushed aside by other people, but she's very calm, especially under pressure. She's very calm under pressure, which I think is an interesting trait. She's very kind to other people, and I just really enjoyed following her. I think she's interesting in comparison to the other Austen protagonists that I have read so far. So like Lizzie Bennet and then Catherine, whose name I cannot remember, from Northanger Abbey. I think she's very different from those, and it made it a very different reading experience. I think my only issue with this book, the only reason it's a 4.5 for me instead of a 5-star, is that we never really see why she likes Wentworth. They're very different people, and we never see them together the first time. We don't really see them interact much during the course of the book, so I was never really clear on like why she wanted to be with Wentworth anyway. So I feel like that was something I wanted a little bit more of. I wanted to understand what the appeal was for her for being with Wentworth. But other than that, I really enjoyed this, and I think that if you like a novel of manners, if you like the Navy, this is tons of stuff about the Navy in it. If you like any of that kind of thing, I highly recommend this particular Jane Austen book. Obviously, I think everybody should read Jane Austen, but like this one in particular, I think is very different from the other works of hers that I've read. So I think it's a fun entry into her oeuvre. Is that how that word is said? I'm not really sure. Okay, and then the last thing that I've read this month, which I literally read yesterday, the last thing I read so far was Moriarty the Patriot, Volume 2 by Ryosuke Takeuchi. And this one is the second volume in a series. It's basically like, what if Moriarty from the Sherlock Holmes stories had good intentions? What if his whole purpose was something kind of positive and good, and then how does he get from there into being the Napoleon of crime? How does he kind of descend into evil from that point? I think this is a really interesting series, kind of looking at Moriarty as a protagonist and considering what his motives might be. I'm really enjoying this. I think it's a lot of fun. It's kind of wacky and over the top at points. It's very entertaining. I think this volume is not quite as strong as the first one, in part because I think it escalates just a little bit too quickly. We get too far into the crime bit right off the bat in this volume. And I think also the first and last chapters, this has 4 chapters in it. The first and last chapters in this are a little bit shaky for me. The first chapter of this is just a little bit too convenient. There's things that happen where we don't really get to see Moriarty's plans unfold. We just kind of get a monologue from him explaining how he has, defeated everyone. And so I felt like that was a little bit too convenient and too easily wrapped up. And then the last volume of this, I don't feel like it's spoilers to say because he's literally on the cover, but we get introduced to Sherlock Holmes in this and the beginning of his antagonism with Moriarty. And the last chapter of this volume is just introducing Sherlock. And I had some issues with this because this is basically Sherlock meeting John and kind of the formation of that friendship. But the problem for me was it basically read like the first chunk of the first episode of BBC Sherlock. It's a very similar setup. It just felt very samey to me. It felt like something I had already witnessed. And I also don't really like the personality of Sherlock in this. He's kind of an asshole. And I don't quite understand that characterization of Sherlock as an asshole in modern adaptations, because I've read some of the originals, not all of them, but a good chunk of the original stories, and he's really not, he's just kind of like socially awkward and doesn't really like to be out in public, but he's not really an asshole in the original stories. He's just kind of awkward and likes to be on his own, and he's generally regarded as being relatively friendly to the people around him, so I don't really get this kind of bent towards portraying him as a jerk in modern adaptations, but he very much leans into that in this particular volume. Anyway, those were the kind of shakier bits. I do want to say though that I gave this 3.5 stars because I really like the middle portions, the middle 2 chapters. That whole section is getting to actually watch Moriarty like build this plan and play out this kind of long chess game against an enemy of his, and it was just really entertaining to watch him kind of outsmart people at every move and kind of be able to guess what he might be doing next, but never quite have a sense of what exactly his plan is until it all kind of culminates together. I really enjoyed that part of seeing his scheme unfold, and I think that was really well done, and that's kind of what I'm hoping for more of in this series. So I am planning to continue reading this. I really enjoy this. I love most everything that's kind of Sherlock Holmes related, so I'm excited to see more of this series. I just think that this volume was a little shakier than there's only one other one that I've read since this is volume 2, but it was a little shakier than the first one for me. So that is everything that I have read so far in March. I briefly forgot what month it was. I do have a couple of things I'm going to be carrying over, which I'll just mention briefly. I don't actually have them with me because I forgot to grab them, but I'm going to be carrying over The Blade itself, which y'all are probably sick of hearing me talk about because I've been reading it for ages. I'm going to carry over She Who Became the Sun, which you're also probably sick of hearing me talk about because I've been reading it for ages. And on both of those, I'm really enjoying the process of reading them slowly and just kind of enjoying the writing. I really am loving both of those books, so like I'm fine with the fact I keep carrying it over, but I recognize that I've been talking about them a lot. And then the last thing I'm going to be carrying over is Claire Coda's Woman Eating, which I just started recently. I've been trying to read more at night before bed instead of looking at TikTok because I feel like I sleep better if I do that. And so I started Woman Eating, and this is a really fascinating book. I'm really enjoying it. I don't think I'm quite vibing with the writing so far, but I really am enjoying following Lydia. So if you're unfamiliar with this book, it follows Lydia, who is a young woman who happens to be a vampire, and she's moving into London, moving out on her own for the first time, and it's about her kind of grappling with like being a young 20-something, trying to live on her own for the first time, trying to get by on her own and grappling with anxiety and issues of identity and all these other things that are, you know, kind of typical of a 20-something-year-old getting by in the world. But on top of that, she's also a vampire, so it adds this additional complexity to her everyday routine and everything that she needs to do to kind of survive on her own. So I feel like it's a really interesting story. I'm liking Lydia so far. I've only been introduced to like one other character so far, which is Ben, who is like another artist in the art studio that she's renting. So I'm curious to see where that's going to go, what that relationship with him is going to look like. And I'm just enjoying this so far. It's an interesting adventure. Oh, the one other thing I wanted to mention is I have an arc of A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. Planning to read that before it comes out on the 28th. So hopefully there should be a video up, I think, on the 28th for that, for its release day. So that should also be coming up soon. But that is actually everything for March. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, I hope you'll consider giving it a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting every Tuesday and Saturday, so there is more content coming soon. And I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.